Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you back to another edition of the Instant Preview and Reaction Series, segment number 32. We are joined by the St. Louis Cardinals beat writer for the Belleville News-Democrat, Jeff Jones. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. How are things over where you are in St. Louis?
So I'm actually down in Jupiter, Florida right now for the start of spring training. So they
Ah,
are
lucky.
a little bit sunburned, I guess, is how things are. But otherwise doing well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on our I guess the first part of our NL Central preview show, and we're extremely grateful to have you. And obviously this is a very different looking St. Louis Cardinals team with I would say the first one being no more Yadier Molina, no more Albert Pujols, and another year of Adam Wainwright. But I want to start off with, kind of post Yachty era, and now it's all Wilson Contreras. How are things looking in that regard?
Yeah, it's going to be a big change of identity really for this team. As closely as Yadier Molina has been tied to the Cardinals for the last 2 decades, that's it's a pretty drastic change just in terms of you bring in one of the star players of a rival at the same position, and the guy who is a different kind of player. Of obviously a very good player in his own right, but a different guy on the field and a different guy off the field as well. So it is going to be a transition. I don't think it's a bad one certainly for the Cardinals, but it's a transition for sure.
Yeah, Ian, take it over.
Do you think, Jeff? I'm just while Joey was kind of hammering on the point regarding Contreras, does it obviously we never want to see a legend of Yachty's stature ever depart after such a long heralded career. But I don't want to say does it sting a little bit, but does it feel a little weird that you guys are inheriting a Cubs catcher with obviously a great resume but ultimately he's there to help you win?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to follow over the next few years in terms of who ends up being right about that, right? Because the Cardinals obviously made that decision and sort of pivoted away from the trade market to be in a position to sign Contreras. Whereas, there are folks with the Cubs who won't go on the record, but certainly are happy to talk off the record uh, that are discussing what they liked and didn't like about Contreras' preparedness and how he game planned and how they kind of projected his defense moving forward. So, for all the posturing, there are definitely different sides of a gamble being taken here between two historic rivals. So it'll be really fascinating to see sort of how that breaks down over the next. We won't know this year, but in 3, 5, 7 years from now, what that kind of looks like.
Really crazy stuff.
Now, would you say the humidity is worse in Jupiter or is it worse in St. Louis right now? Where's it hitting worse right now?
Yeah, this time of year right now, it's a little worse in Jupiter. Plus, you kind of get the shock of you leave home and it's 35 degrees, and you get here and it's 85 degrees, and there's not a lot of transition time in between.
The next point I wanted to bring up, Jeff, is a big piece from last year. Obviously, the most important piece that helped really drive the St. Louis Cardinals to that late stretch to pull off that winning streak and help them win another NL Central crown. And that's obviously the reigning most valuable player in the National League, Paul Goldschmidt. What are you seeing early? I mean, spring training's really just started. I mean, pitchers and catchers have been there for a couple of weeks now, but as spring training games are set to start, are you seeing a little bit more of the same Goldie that you saw last year? Do you think he might regress a little bit this season?
So I think the answer can be both, right? I think it's pretty hard to sort of put up the kind of season he put up last year in consecutive years. He could be one of the 5 best players in the NL instead of the best player in the NL this year, and it would still be a regression, right? But the thing about Paul Goldschmidt is that he's really consistent day in, day out, year in, year out. His work looks like his work, and he looks like the player that he's been. Eventually time comes for all of us, and that will happen to Paul Goldschmidt someday. But no, I can't tell you that the guy that we see in camp right now is any different than the guy that we saw in camp when he arrived 4 years ago. It looks like the same guy to me, and the consistency I think is so much of what the Cardinals were excited about when they acquired him in the first place.
So let's say hypothetically now Goldschmidt takes maybe a little bit of a step back. Is Arenado now going to come in and, I mean, obviously just someone of Arenado's stature should be able to come in and step in and kind of make up for those numbers right away? Are we seeing the same kind of Nolan Arenado that we're used to seeing?
Yeah, it was interesting kind of early in camp, the number of times that Nolan got asked whether Goldschmidt winning the MVP is motivating for him in some way or, makes him want to challenge himself. And to me, that's the answer to that question is not very interesting because he doesn't need the motivation, right? Like there's no lack of Nolan Arenado finding drive for himself, just in sort of the way he kind of like monomaniacally prepares to play baseball. So sure, can he fill in if there were to be a downslide? Absolutely. That's just sort of the way these guys have pushed each other over their time as teammates.
Jeff, I got to ask you this, since we are located in the New York market, and obviously a lot of Yankees and Mets fans want to know, well, actually more so Yankees fans want to know about Jordan Montgomery, because I mean, again, I'm a Yankees fan and I'd love to know about how he's doing here and kind of full year number one, or year and a half, if you will, in his tenure in St. Louis. And obviously for those New Yorkers around here, at first they were not too happy with that trade because there was nothing else getting done. But again, that was all in the past. But how has Montgomery looked in his first spring training with the Cardinals?
Yeah, I think the Montgomery that we've seen this spring has been a different guy, honestly, than we saw at the end of the year. Obviously he had a really strong stretch for the Cardinals, performed well, was arguably their best starter down the stretch last year. Say maybe Jose Quintana, new Met, I guess. But there definitely seems to be a little bit of, I think, a little bit of shell shock after the deal happened. I think a little bit of reticence to talk about the Yankees too much, lest it be perceived, and whether you want to read that as mad he got traded or hard feelings, whatever. I think he was trying to step around that. And I think the guy that we've seen so far in spring has been a little more relaxed, a little more himself, maybe a little more integrated with his teammates, a little more involved in all that stuff. So I think a guy who's kind of getting comfortable, which sort of raises the question of, what does the end of his year look like? Because he has free agency looming this winter. The Cardinals, with only one starter under contract for next year, are going to want to look at those options. So I do think that sort of Montgomery's fit in St. Louis in spring is a thing that's probably worth keeping an eye on.
Jeff, what do we see also with Steven Matz too? And obviously, I know that was a long time ago with the Mets and his, but he is a Long Island boy. So how has he been? How has he been? In spring training in the early going too.
Yeah, I think primarily he looks healthy, right? He's taken all of his turns as needed. Hasn't been any strange rescheduling going on. The Cardinals just need him to be the version that they saw for whatever it was, 3-4 starts last year. They need him to be fully healthy and on the field, and that's historically been the challenge for Matz. And so it's a matter of whether or not he can kind of get himself back to that kind of equilibrium. And if he can, he's going to be Steven Matz. He's going to be what they paid for, and that's a perfectly good middle of the rotation kind of starter.
Yeah, Ian Schraier, take it over.
And that would make certainly for a good 5-starter. And myself being a Mets fan, I remember 2015 and 2016 Steven Matz very well. Joey spoke a little bit about the back end of the rotation. I want to highlight a little bit more about the front end. And obviously a glaring concern that we've seen the last couple of years has certainly been the health of Jack Flaherty. We know that Miles Michaelis had to, who really at one point for the Cardinals also had some experience atop the Cardinals rotation. So coming into this spring, I mean, I don't want to say what the pressure is, but what are the expectations on Jack? And if that's not the case, can Miles kind of come in and step in and fill that role again as the one?
Yeah, for Jack, the expectation is stay healthy. The belief is really strong around camp that if Flaherty is healthy, he doesn't have to be like the pitcher he was in 2019. He could be a more mature, even arguably better pitcher who better understands the challenges of that. So it's just a matter of whether or not he can stay on the field. In terms of Miles, I think that there is definitely mutual interest between the player and the team in terms of him working on an extension. I think he probably is the most likely of their pitchers to do so during spring. But I also think that you should probably not expect to see that before the World Baseball Classic, because frankly, what incentive is there for the Cardinals to sign him to a big extension, have him go to the WBC, and knock on wood, something happens and that deal looks much worse in 2 weeks than it did right now. So I think if all goes well and he comes back to the WBC ship shape, I think you can see this going to come together pretty quickly between Michaelis and the Cardinals.
Did let's shift subjects here to the bullpen for a second. I know there were within the regarding the pitch clock and the effect it might have on the closer Giovanni Gallegos.
Yeah.
Has that been a kind of a subject matter that's been brought up to him in the spring in terms of somebody who works very slowly is now going to have to kind of amp up exactly what he does? And because as a closer, everything's all about repetition. Everything's all about kind of just getting the feel for where you feel comfortable, obviously, to get 3 big outs in the 9th inning every single night for 162 days. So has that kind of been discussed? Do we feel that there's going to be a little bit of an acclimation phase for him with that?
Yeah, he threw his first live bullpen of the spring on Wednesday, and so the next day, Thursday, a day he ordinarily wouldn't throw, given kind of that structure of spring. He was back out on a bullpen mound with the bullpen coach Julio Rangel, who had a stopwatch, and they were basically just sort of dry running through Gallegos' mechanics and timing him at different parts of it to sort of see, where is it long, where can there be some trim. It's going to be a process for him for sure. He was among the 2 or 3 slowest pitchers across Major League Baseball last season, and there's no question he's going to have to speed it up. The challenge, I think, is going to be that he again is going to go to the WBC and compete for Mexico, where these rules are not going to be enforced. And so the difficulty for the Cardinals is going to be making sure that there's no backslide, that he doesn't kind of get it under control and figure out a pattern and then go to the WBC, and then oops, he comes back and it's the way that he used to be. That's going to be, I think, a big challenge this spring for him.
Can they necessarily ask in that situation where potentially Giovanni's away playing for his country for a couple of weeks? Can they, especially in the spring down in Jupiter, can they potentially revert to a before Gallegos was in the fold, Jordan Hicks was a closer for a time, so before he went down with injury. So is there a possibility maybe to revert back to Jordan Hicks if things with Gallegos don't pan out early on?
Yeah, I think that, the success they had with Helsley last season and sort of taking over in that spot at the end of the year, Helsley gets to his first All-Star team and turned into kind of an exciting story for them last year. So I think that they're pretty covered there. They definitely do rely on Gallegos for important innings, kind of in those middle chunks, late in games. And Ali Marmol has been really specific about preferring not to declare a closer so much as pitch to the matchups. It's a thing managers say now, however much they believe it. Probably up for debate. But I do think they do have some coverage there if the pitch clock was to sort of throw a wrench in the Gallegos early in the season.
That's definitely something that we have to watch for. But, sticking with pitchers for a quick second, I know I kind of wanted to save this for last, and I'm sure Ian's probably going to virtually slap me when I say this, but got to talk about Adam Wainwright, of course. This is most likely it for him. And, how has his spring training been in the early going? And, obviously pitchers and catchers reported last week. So, it's only obviously a small sample size that you've gotten to see, but it's wild. How old is he already? He's
41. 41
yeah,
turns 40,
41.
turns 42 August 31st, which I know off the top of my head because a story I have been working on for the weekend has included running around to folks in the clubhouse and asking if certain world events happened before or after Adam Wainwright was born. And some of the responses have been pretty fun.
Oh, where's our co-host Joey when we need him right now?
Oh man, we definitely need Mike Szabo here. That is fantastic.
Well,
I can tell you, I can tell you, Adam is exactly 30 days younger than MTV.
That's very good.
Funny you mentioned that, Jeff, because we have a very young co-host, and we have moments with him all the time over text or right here on the show every Friday.
Yeah.
Where we ask him, "Were you alive? Do you remember who this is?" So being a Cardinals, and I assume, Jeff, you were born and raised a Cardinals fan. You're originally from St. Louis.
I am, yeah.
Yeah. So we were talking the other day about the new rules and all the new implements into baseball, and we were talking about the pitch clock and how the person who served up McGuire's home run was Steve Traxel, and he was known for being so slow. The human rain delay, and I remember we asked Mike if he remembered who that was, and of course he didn't. So it's we have these type of conversations every day.
But I can tell you that the pitch clock work has been really high tech too, because you walk around the backfields back here. And clearly they went to the closest Walmart and bought every 32-inch on-brand, ONN brand, like the cheap Walmart TV brand. They bought everyone they had in stock and kind of wirelessly hooked them up to a clock. But they're now 3 on every field to act as the pitch clock. So that was the tech fix, was to buy out the local Walmart of 32-inch clock.
Oh man, say Jeff, I got to ask you this though, because it's a perfect segue with all the rule changes, everything like that, with the bigger bases and everything like that. It's wild to see, and you can see all the memes and stuff like that with the bigger bases and smaller players, or smaller bases, bigger players, whatever it is. But in all seriousness though, this bigger base thing, I got to ask you not only your personal opinion, but what have you seen in the early going with spring training too, with these, with these much bigger bases that, we're used to seeing?
Yeah, so far they only look different in terms of kind of being a strange scale, I guess, to catch your eye and you look around.
Yeah.
Nothing seems different in terms of pace of play and whatnot yet. We'll see what happens with base running when games get going. Teams are always more aggressive stealing bases in spring anyway, so it's not going to be a perfect gauge. But I think the way to look at it is, with the new bases, you're talking about like 6 inches less base to base, right? And think about the number of times you've seen a guy steal a base and be out by the toe of his shoe or the tips of his fingers. That
Yeah.
does that account for one extra base a game? Even if it's not quite that much, they do add up. They end up being substantial. One extra base a game over the course of a season is 40 extra runs, right? So it definitely will add up, or can, if teams take advantage of it.
Yeah, truly
It
something.
just
Go
it
on.
just seems like, Jeff, that and these again are conversations that Joey and myself have had repeatedly, where we're saying to ourselves that the commissioner of Major League Baseball, Rob Manfred, is trying to recruit a younger fan, trying to attract a younger fan base to baseball. And I grew up, 38 years old. I love baseball and everything about it. I grew up on it. And it just seems like by doing this, like he's attracting a younger fan base. He wants to almost bring back the steroid era and bring back, the 98 home run chase, but without doing it without the PEDs. So let's try to find ways to score more runs and just keep fans engaged. Are you kind of getting that same feel? Do you think this experiment's going to succeed, maybe fail?
Yeah, I think for Manfred, the bigger concern for the moment is sort of maintaining the audience that they have, and kind of reintroducing excitement into the game. And frankly, there is a broadcast benefit to this, right? Like there is a financial incentive, because if you have the games a little bit shorter with the introduction of the pitch clock, they become a little bit more predictable in terms of like advertising inventory and the way that the broadcast is presented. Yeah, to me, one of the really fascinating things that hasn't really been, we haven't seen it yet, is what the broadcast looks like if it does lose 27 minutes off the game or whatever happened to AAA. So the game is going to feel different, and I would be, I'd be shocked if it wasn't in some way monetized differently as a result, because primarily that's what the commissioner ends up doing, whether it's younger fans, older fans, or really anybody can kind of get his hands on, seemingly.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Jeff. Obviously the outfield is very young for the Cardinals, and you've got Tyler O'Neill, Dylan Carlson, Lars Nootbaar as well. And in the early going, it all looked really, really good. Is this something that like one of their I guess one of their strengths, if you will, or was last year with these three guys something that, is there any possible regression from any of them, or maybe like a kind of like a sophomore slump type of thing, or are these guys the real deal?
Yeah, I think that when they made the decision last summer to trade Harrison Bader, which really is one that they'd set up the year prior, they signed Bader to a deal that took him through his arbitration, but not past the end of it, right? So they were sort of just setting up a future where that deal would need to be made.
Yeah.
They were of the opinion that the guys that they had were going to be able to be adequate fill-ins. And, Dylan Carlson played really well in center and had about a month where he hit really well as well, but then found himself in a spot where he had an injury that maybe he kind of tried to play through. And so that became difficult for him. At the same time, Tyler O'Neill arrived in camp and has made it very clear that he would like to start in center, and that's a goal that he has for spring. So, they do trust the group. Nootbaar is a guy that over the winter, when there were conversations about trades, teams were asking about Lars Nootbaar, and they were happily moving on from those conversations. So they are happy with the group they have now. The way that they possibly get positioned, and in the way that how long each of them holds on to that job, is a fair open question.
Ian, take it away.
Jeff, let's kind of focus now a little bit on where the Cardinals stand among the rest of the division as we kind of wrap this up. Tell us, I mean, we saw the streak that the Cardinals went on. I had alluded to it earlier, the streak that they went on late in the season to run towards that Central crown. I feel like when you stack them up with the rest of the division, it's Milwaukee's still there. The Cubs got a little bit better, but I still feel, and I don't know if you would agree with me or Jeff, that it's still probably the Cardinals' division to lose.
Yeah, I agree for sure. I think this Cardinals team has one of, I would say, a higher floor and a lower ceiling maybe than many teams have in Central for a pretty good amount of time. I don't see any of these teams really as a challenger. I think the Brewers probably are likely to get worse throughout the season. Maybe they trade Corbin Burns at the deadline, or something else happens that breaks that team up. I think it's entirely possible. The Cubs, the Cubs had an interesting winter in that they signed a half dozen guys with a lot of MLB experience, some of whom could work out. It's like if you spent $30 on 6 scratcher tickets, maybe you win 5,000, or maybe you just lost $30, right? There's a possibility there, and one of those options is much more likely. But some of those could work out for the Cubs, and they definitely took the swings and took them in a way that if they don't work, they could probably still get some draft capital or some prospect capital, for those guys come the deadline.
And just to kind of allude back to what you were talking about the Brewers and the Cubs, I was kind of going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on Corbin Burns and the acquisitions in Chicago, like Cody Bellinger and Dansby Swanson. And I do believe that come, September, I don't expect really the Cubs to be making any sort of playoff push with how strong the National League is. But I could see, just because Corbin Burns seems very unhappy with how the arbitration discussions went with in Milwaukee. Christian Yelich just appears to be so enigmatic since his MVP year. We know that the Pirates are rebuilding. The Reds really are in disarray. But getting back again on point to the Brewers and the Cubs, I feel like there's just a part of me, and maybe it's the Cardinals fan in you as well, Jeff, that feels that maybe just with those couple of acquisitions, and the Cubs were very competitive, especially in the second half of the season last year, that I feel that maybe Milwaukee could regress, and maybe even the Cubs could jump them into second place this year.
Yeah, I think if you told me today that the Cubs would be in second and the Brewers would be in third, I wouldn't flinch at that. That sounds entirely reasonable to me, especially given just the way that those trends are definitely pointing, and what seems like the Brewers are kind of moving into maybe a little bit of a different state in terms of how competitive they actually think that they want to be and how much they think they can sustain over the long term.
Jeff, I got to ask you this one last thing. And this is, something I guess kind of just to wrap this whole thing up here. Is there someone that Cardinals fans and really Major League Baseball fans as a whole, is there someone in spring training that has wowed you in the early going? Possibly than, someone that we really didn't hear from last year that might be an X factor this year?
Yeah, if you want to go into a really deep cut, the Cardinals at the Rule 5 draft actually took a right-hander from the Yankees named Wilking Rodriguez. And this is a guy who has played in Mexico for the last couple of years, made a very brief appearance in MLB in about 2014, was in the minors for a while, had a PED suspension in the minors, went to Mexico, and is now back. And the Cardinals attempted to sign him out of the Mexican League last summer, and his Mexican League team wouldn't let him go. The Yankees picked him up over the winter, and then the Cardinals took him in the Rule 5 draft by virtue of his, he was old enough, wasn't on the 40-man, etc. He's in camp now. He has those Rule 5 restrictions, so if the Cardinals don't keep him, he has to be offered back to the Yankees for free. And there were folks watching him throw a bullpen the other day where they were really impressed. Like they kind of described it as didn't miss a spot and then ramped, had the sinker going from 89, 90, 92, 94, and had that real good, precise improvement kind of as the session went on. So I don't know how much the 10th reliever on a team can really catch somebody's eye, but in terms of guys that I think have turned some heads in camp, he'd be one to keep an eye on.
That's what makes spring training, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, someone from the St. Louis Cardinals, we've got Jeff Jones with us here. And Jeff, thank you so much for coming on here. St. Louis beat writer for the Belleville News-Democrat. And Jeff, enjoy Jupiter, Florida, because I could tell you this much. Up here in New York, we are extremely jealous that you're getting some sun.
Well, so I think some of your neighbors have already made it down here for the winter, or maybe almost all winter.
So. It's so true. Who knows? Maybe you might be seeing Ian and myself there soon. Oh man, Jeff, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in the next few moments here on the Eastern Observer.